Hi everyone, sorry it's been a while since my last video. I've just had a lot of things come up and I haven't had a chance to get back into it. But I just wanted to point out a couple of conversations that came up since my last video that I thought were interesting that I wanted to talk a little bit about. One of them was this comment over here by Robert Mitchell where he pointed out a teaching that I wasn't familiar with that's concerning the Christ oil, which is actually the cerebral spinal fluid. And so I did a little bit of research on that, and what I found was really interesting. I came up with this YouTube video over here that I wanted to talk a little bit about. Okay, another discussion that came up was on this video over here by Pastor Sandy Armstrong that was on the 117, the Rapture Code, and I had left a comment over here which started a conversation with someone. And so I wanted to explain this a little bit more because I pretty much explained my position over here in this comment or in these comments over here, and so I don't really have time to go over all of this, but I would just encourage anyone first of all to watch the video, but then to also read these comments over here because I pretty much explain my position over here. But I want to talk about this a little bit more because one of the things that I explained in the comments over here is that there was no year zero when the timeline was created, when the calendars changed from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar, and they decided to divide up the years to before Christ and after death. And so there was no year zero. So the year that Christ was born was actually 1 AD. So that means that in the year 1 AD, which is supposedly the year that Christ was born, that means on the date of Jesus's birth, he was already 1 year old based on this calendar. And so the year zero was completely skipped. It just goes from 1 BC to 1 AD, so there's no year zero. And so the point that I was trying to make, and I've explained this before, is that we're only 8 months into the year 2018. And so it's not exactly 2018 years yet. It won't be 2018 years until the end of 2018, from the year 1 AD to 2018 for the full 2018 years to be over. It would have to be at the end of the year, and then we start working into the year 2019. So presently we're 2017 years and 8 months into the year 2018. And so that's why I believe this Rapture Code that Pastor Sandy Armstrong is talking about here is still valid. And one of the things that I pointed out over here in the comments, which I've pointed out before, okay, it's over here where I talk about in Genesis 7:11 is when the windows of heaven open, but then they shut in Genesis 8:2. And so the number 2 could be interpreted as 1 plus 1. So you have 7:11, the windows open, 8:11, the windows shut. But in actuality, it'll be a twinkling of an eye. And so I believe it occurs somewhere between the years 2017 and 2018. Okay, so what I want to point out in this video, and I actually made a little outline of some of the things that I want to talk about just to show you all the things that I've been wanting to talk about. And so I don't know how much time we have left and how much I can go over before the Lord returns, because I do believe we're in the time frame right now, which is what I want to explain here. What I want to explain is how there also seems to be a code not just the 117 code, but there's a code with the number 28. And this was also mentioned over here by Robert Mitchell. He mentions that the number for heaven is the number 28, and so I did a little research into the number 28. And I found this article over here that seems to confirm it. Of course, there's so much more evidence to go over. I can't really go over all the evidence for the number 28. I'm going to try to go over some of all of this. Some of this I've mentioned before, but I'm going to try to go over as much as I can. But this is a very important clue right here, I believe, because in this article it explains that the veil of the temple was actually 28 cubits long, and of course the veil is what separates the temple from the most holy place. And of course the most holy place would be a representation of heaven, and so you have 28 cubits is the length of the veil that was rent. Of course, when Jesus died on the cross, the veil was rent, which is also a type of and shadow of what's going to happen when Jesus comes back. And this was recorded in Exodus 26:2, which the numbers themselves add up to 28, which is another indication that this is definitely a clue. And there's some other examples over here that seem to point to why the number 28 is important in the Bible. Okay, another thing that I wanted to point out, and this was pointed out by Pastor Sandy Armstrong as well in another video. He talked about the very first verse of the Bible, which is Genesis 1:1. It actually has 28 letters, and he was talking about how if you divide up the letters into units, that it actually forms a triangle with the 7th row adding up to 28 units. So the very first verse is exactly 28 letters, and when you divide it into 7 rows, of course 7 is the number of completion, it adds up to 28. And I've talked about before how God tells us the end from the beginning, and I've talked about how I believe the number 28 represents the year 2018. Over here it says it represents the years 1928 and 2028, but I've talked about how I believe that 28 is a representation of the year 2018 and that it's synonymous. I did a Bible code on the number 27, which seemed to confirm that 27 is short for 2017. Came up with 117 matches. The very first line in the matrix was the fact that Lamech lived 777 years. The very last line in the matrix was that God would not strive with man for more than 120 years, and 2017 is the 120th Jubilee, so I believe God confirmed it. So I believe 28 is short for 2018, so I believe it represents the year 2018 as well. Okay, and the point that Pastor Sandy Armstrong was making when he pointed this out is that God created everything. He created heaven and earth, and there just so happens to be 14 joints in each hand for a total of 28 joints. And so this is just one of the proofs that God wrote the Bible and that he created everything, because he created everything by molding it and shaping it with his hands, as we're told in Genesis 2. Okay, you see that in verse 2:7, which makes the number 27, and incidentally, the Strong's number for hand, which is the word yad, and this is half of the name of God, which is behold the hand, behold the nail. I've talked about this before, but the word hand is Strong's number 3027, and there just so happens to be 27 bones in the human hand. So I've mentioned that before, and this is something I've been wanting to talk a little bit more about. But it's over here in verse 2:7 where it says God formed man out of the dust of the ground, and then the word formed is the word yatsar, which means to form, fashion, frame. And if you look at this word in the Greek, I think it gives you an even better description, because the word in the Greek is this word right here, eplasen. And you can see the definition here. It means I form, mold as a potter his clay. So this is the word that you would use if you're like making something with Play-Doh. This is the word that you would use in the Greek to describe that. Okay, so the point that I want to make is that God seems to be confirming the number 27 or 2017 as well as the number 28 or 2018, and I have all sorts of scriptures here that seem to confirm that. Some of these I've talked about before, such as Genesis 8:11, which I just explained. Okay, it's actually in Genesis 8:1, which makes number 18 backwards, Genesis 8:2, which makes 8111, which is 118 backwards, and it's in Genesis 8:11. All of these are key verses, as well as 17 and 18, that seem to point to the second coming. If you look at verse 1, which makes 18 backwards, this is where it says, "And God remembered Noah and every living thing, and all the cattle that was with him in the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged." And if you look at the word wind, you see that it's the word ruach, which is the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit. And even the word ruach seems to reflect the 3 sevens at 7307. But you see that this is a representation of the Spirit of God. It's the Holy Spirit, or God's Holy Spirit. And this is also stated in the very second verse in the Bible. So this is a parallel to Genesis 1:2. Again, God tells us the end from the beginning, and this is something I've mentioned before, that in verse 2, right after verse 1, where it says, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth," then in verse 2 it says, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." Okay, and I've explained before that the word for move in the Greek is Strong's number 2018. Okay, I just copy and pasted that word, and you can see it right here, Strong's 2018. It means to bring upon. And so God brought upon the face of the earth waters. And so this is a direct correlation to Genesis 8:1, which again you have 18. Okay, that would be right here, Genesis 8:1. It says, "And God remembered Noah and every living thing, and all the cattle that was with him on the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth." So this is the same thing being described here, the ruach going over the earth, just as you have the Spirit of God moving over the earth, which at the time was dark and void. And once again, the word moved is Strong's number 2018. Okay, and then I've talked about the only tree that survived was an olive tree in verse 11, that the dove brought back a branch in its mouth, the dove representing the bride in this case, I believe. And then I've talked about verse 13, which is the verse that came up in my second Advent table, where it talks about the second month, and the word second was coming right next to the word Advent. It's actually in verse 14, where it mentions the second month and the 27th day of the month. And I've talked about how the numbers 17 and 27 are synonymous. And again, it mentions the 600 years, which represents 6,000 years. And the second millennium is represented here in verse 14, and the 27th day representing the year 2017. And this time it comes up in Genesis 8. Okay, so the point I want to make is that there's a code for the year 2018 as well as the year 2017 throughout the Bible, and I have all these other references that I want to talk about, but I'm about out of time, so I'll have to continue in the next video.